elections in other countries. Whenever you see an election reported in the news, maybe it's Spain, maybe it's Poland, maybe it's Macedonia, there's often a bit at the end that says, and the international observers said it was free and fair, or the international observers said there were problems here. And there is a whole system of people being sent out to observe international elections. And I've wondered for years how this happened, but this year I actually managed to go on 2 particular election missions, one to North Macedonia and one to Ukraine. And what I want to do is talk about how the system works and some of the differences I noticed in elections there and elections here. Maybe encourage some of you to get involved in that sort of work, and make a few reflections on what that might mean for the way we run elections in this country. I've taken some photographs. They're my photographs, so they're not professional, but it will just enable me to tell you something about the political atmosphere in both those places and the way the elections run. And if I've done it right, these photos should turn over about every 30 seconds very nicely for me. And if I've done it wrong, it won't. So let's see. Okay, so first one I went to was North Macedonia. North Macedonia is a new name for this country. It was called Macedonia. This caused a massive row with Greece because Greece has a bit called Macedonia. And the Greeks felt that Macedonia, calling itself Macedonia, was implying it would take over part of Greece. There was an agreement between Macedonia and Greece that the name of the country would be changed. And based on this change, Greece said it would stop blocking Macedonia joining the EU. So, we are here for the presidential election. They make a lot of, this is one of the candidates, lots and lots of billboards everywhere. This is in Skopje, which is the capital of Macedonia. Interesting election laws there, because actually on polling day and the day before, all these posters are supposed to come down, because there's supposed to be a period of reflection before people vote, which obviously we don't see in this country. When you go to a polling station, to visit, when you're an international observer, you look for the sorts of things that are on display. And in Macedonia, the law is that every polling station has to have very detailed instructions in at least one language, usually 2, because often it's Albanian as well, explaining to voters how they vote. And if you look at these pictures, you'll see there's quite a process to do with ID checking when they vote, and I'll come back to that. There is no postal voting in Macedonia, but if you're not able to come out of your house to vote, they will go to you the day before polling day and collect your vote. So this is a team from one of the polling stations in the town we were sent to, out with their ballot box, calling on what they call homebound voters to get their vote. So there is huge efforts going on to make sure that everybody actually has the ability to vote. This is a polling station. Many of the polling stations in rural areas are in schools. It's the only public building that can be used. And you can see that the conditions are not great for getting into polling stations there. This is a sort of fairly standard primary school in one of the Albanian villages in the area we were in. The reason I'm showing that is not to say they have rubbish polling stations, but actually the conditions in many of the Macedonian polling stations are not what we would like to see. These are all the ballot boxes at the regional centre when the counting has been done. And you can see straight away that everything is clear. There is a huge effort in both of the elections that I observed to make sure that everything was clear and transparent. When I come on to Ukraine, I'll illustrate to you one of the differences between counting in the UK and counting in some other countries. So that's Macedonia. Presidential election was in 2 rounds, so I went twice. They have a requirement for a certain percentage of people to vote for it to be valid. They only just got that 40% requirement. But the election happened, it was reasonably free and fair, and the result was respected. So, Ukraine had a new president elected, and he decided to have early parliamentary elections. So we were back there in July. We were sent very near the line by the so-called independent republics. This is one of the polling stations in a village in the area we were working in. Some of them are fantastic. Some of the former Communist Party buildings are wonderful. Some of the other buildings that people vote in are not so great, but this would be a standard rural type of polling station set up for Ukraine. And this is inside the polling station. There were about 16 people working as polling clerks on the day, and this is some of them. These people are representatives of different political parties, because it's one of the ways that they try to make sure that things are transparent and seem to be fair, is by having the political parties involved in that process. We wouldn't have that in this country. We wouldn't have political party people sitting behind the desk. They're very keen on transparency at the voting stage as well. This is a standard Ukrainian ballot box. You can see it's completely clear. I mean, sadly, people haven't folded their papers up so you can see how they voted, but it's completely clear. You can see there's no ballot stuffing at the beginning of the day. You can see exactly what's in there. There's a huge stress on making sure that people feel the process is fair and transparent. What's different in Macedonia and Ukraine is that they count the ballot papers in the polling station. When you see elections on the telly here, you see them all being taken to a big hall, don't you? Well, here they count them in the polling station. So this is the polling station we observed, and I'm counting the ballot papers. There were 26 candidates for one of the elections going on, and there was a slightly shorter list for one of the others. You can't see this very well, but this is just to show you the length of the ballot papers that they were dealing with in Ukraine. So you can see that counting that was quite complicated, but at every stage the officials are making sure that every observer could see that everything was being done in a fair and transparent way. Once all the counting's done at the polling station, this is all taken to a regional centre to be collated, and every single result is announced very publicly. This photo is terrible, but this is a guy at the regional centre announcing the results. This is about 6 in the morning, that's why it's all blurry. This particular process in the area we were on went on for about 72 hours. Big rural area with terrible roads, people having to bring the results from all sorts of remote places. It took forever and ever and ever before those results came through. So you don't need to know how elections work in North Macedonia or Ukraine, but the reason I showed those pictures is to illustrate some points that I thought were interesting about the process of those elections. These are both post-communist places where the democratic systems are pretty new, and there's a sort of concern that corruption is seen to be avoided, that things are seen to be fair. And a lot of work has gone on to making sure that people who vote are who they say they are. So, ID cards are checked, signatures are checked. In Macedonia, they spray your thumb when you vote, and they check people's thumbs when they arrive to make sure it's not already sprayed. So there are checks and checks and checks to make sure there's no duplication. They absolutely ban political activity on polling day. This is a shocker to me, because I'm used to get out the vote campaigns and making sure people turn up. Absolutely banned. It's a huge offence to have political activity on polling day there, and it's to minimise undue influence being put on people. So huge amount of work that has gone into that. And I had conversations with some of the polling people, because when you're an observer, you go to a polling station, you have to stay about 50 minutes to watch what's going on. So you chat. And they asked me about elections in the UK, and they were quite shocked when I said, oh, I just turn up and I say, I'm Paula Keaveney, and no one says, prove it. They were absolutely shocked, and they were absolutely shocked about many of the processes that we take for granted that operate in our democracy. And it did make me wonder whether actually there are lessons that we can take from the way elections operate in some of these other countries. So I'm going to come back to that. But what I want to do is just say a little bit about the international system, how it works, and why you might want to get involved. The way of getting recruited onto these, I have to say, is quite opaque. Once you've found out how to do it, it's quite easy. But you can't just look in the phone book and find a heading saying election observers and ring them up. You need to know who to contact. The way the system works is that I went with the Organisation for Security and Cooperation in Europe. When there's an election coming up, the organisation will often do what's called a needs assessment. So they'll visit a country, they'll talk about the system, they'll look at the election law, and they'll say, do we think we need to go and do an observation in this country? At that point, they nearly always say yes, but it might be a big observation or a small one. And they are effectively invited in by the country to come and observe. At that point, they say, OK, we need 400 people, or we need 700 people. There were 750 people in Ukraine doing this. And the members of the OSCE will then decide whether they want to fund people to go and be election observers. So I was funded by the UK government. Yeah, I'm not paying to do this, and there's no charity paying me. The UK government funds observers from the UK, Switzerland funds Swiss citizens, Canada funds Canadian citizens, and so on. But the recruitment is done not through the Foreign Office, but through NGOs and other organisations in the UK. So once you know which organisations they are, you can start to get on their books. The UK doesn't fund people to go everywhere. It has particular countries it's interested in. So I noticed they're going to be funding people to do Uzbekistan in December, but they're not showing any interest in funding people to do Poland. So there will be choices made by the government as to where they want to send people, but they will be sending people. And when I first applied to do this, I thought, well, I teach politics, I've been a councillor, I've done lots of elections, I know all the stuff, and that's true. But I also discovered that lots of people who were doing it didn't have that background. They were just people with common sense who knew a bit about elections but weren't experts, and were able to understand a brief. So you shouldn't let a lack of election experience or a lack of high-level political expertise put you off thinking about doing this. The system of ensuring democracy only works if there are enough people internationally who can keep this process going. And if there's one message I can get you to take away, it's to think about whether this is something that you would want to do. I've learned a huge amount just on these 2 visits, and I'll be honest, I'm applying for Uzbekistan because it sounds like it would be a fascinating one to do. It enriches your thinking about democracy and you're thinking about the way international relations works. And I've got to say, I've changed my mind about something as a result of these visits. I always used to be the sort of person that would read something by the Electoral Reform Society and think, yes, I like them, they are always right. The Electoral Reform Society has been campaigning against using ID to vote in the UK. You may be aware there have been a number of pilot schemes, some this year, some in a previous year. The nearest one to us was Pendle, looking at the use of ID for voting. Having seen the processes in Macedonia and the processes in Ukraine, I now believe that we should adopt a system of having to prove who we are when we go to vote in this country. I feel that the lack of that could cause people to lose faith in the system. And actually, if people lose faith in the system, they're not going to take part, and if they're not going to take part, our democratic legitimacy will fail. Some have argued that asking for ID would disenfranchise young people. And I think that's right if you ask for things like gas bills addressed to someone's house. But, I teach students, their pockets are full of different bits of photo ID for this, that and the other. It wouldn't be difficult. People say also it would be a huge change, and we're not used to that. But you know what? We do it in Northern Ireland already. In Northern Ireland, we already print material that people can use to say, this is me and I'm entitled to vote. So, 2 takeaways from this. My first takeaway is, please do think about being an election observer. It is great fun, and you will learn a lot, and you'll contribute to ensuring the maintenance of democracy. And my second takeaway is, if you have views about ID at elections, and you are like me and you are very much against it, please think again, because I think the use of ID for people voting will help make sure that we have legitimacy in our democratic systems. And I think I've run over my time, so I will stop there.